I've been talking about Ginny Thomas, it seems like forever. And I knew she was a stone freak, but I had no idea the woman was truly, now I'm not saying this gratuitously, but truly insane. Truly, completely out of her crawl space. And what Bob Woodward and Robert Costa at the Washington Post have produced by way of defining her craziness should shock the hell out of all of us. We are in a world of trouble. So today what I'm going to do is quote as directly as I can from Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's piece in the Washington Post. The headline is simply, Virginia Thomas urged White House Chief Mark Meadows to pursue unrelenting efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, let me say that these, and I'll get into this in the article that these two men have written. These, what they've written comes from texts that this crazy woman sent to Mark Meadows. You remember Mark Meadows was subpoenaed to testify, and he turned over a huge tranche of documents, emails and shit. He probably didn't realize what he was turning over. And then he decided at the last minute, nope, I'm not going to testify. Well, all of this comes from emails and texts that passed between this psycho woman, Ginny Thomas, and this poor miserable bastard, Mark Meadows, who was Trump's chief of staff. And it reads like, I know this is a cliche, but it reads like a movie plot to overthrow the government of the United States, which in fact it was and is. Here's the piece. Virginia Thomas, a conservative activist married to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, repeatedly pressed White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to pursue unrelenting efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election in a series of urgent text exchanges in the critical weeks after the vote, according to copies of those texts obtained by the Washington Post and CBS News. The messages, 29 in all, reveal an extraordinary pipeline between Virginia Thomas, who goes by Ginny, and President Donald Trump's top aide during a period when Trump and his allies were vowing to go to the Supreme Court in an effort to negate the election results. On November 10, after news organizations had projected Joe Biden the winner based on state vote totals, Ginny Thomas wrote to Mark Meadows, quote, "Help this great president stand firm, Mark. You are the leader with him who is standing for America's constitutional governance at the precipice. The majority knows Biden and the left is attempting the greatest heist in our history." End quote. When Meadows wrote to Ginny Thomas, on November 24th, the White House Chief of Staff invoked God to describe the effort to overturn the election. Meadows wrote, quote, "This is a fight of good versus evil. Evil always looks like the victor until the King of Kings triumphs. Do not grow weary in well-doing. The fight continues. I have staked my career on it. Well, at least my name in D.C. on it." End quote. Ginny replied, quote, "Thank you. I needed that. This plus a conversation with my best friend just now. I will try to keep holding on. America is worth it." End quote. It is unclear to whom Thomas was referring when she said, best friend. In her text messages to Meadows, Ginny Thomas spread false theories, commented on cable news segments, and advocated with urgency and fervor that the president and his team take action to reverse the outcome of the election. She urged that they take a hard line with Trump staffers and congressional Republicans who had resisted arguments that the election was stolen. In the messages, Thomas and Meadows each assert a belief that the election was stolen and seem to share a solidarity of purpose and faith, though they occasionally express differences on tactics. Thomas wrote to Meadows on November 19th, in an apparent reference to Justice Thomas's 1991 confirmation hearings, in which lawyer Anita Hill testified that he, Thomas, had made unwanted sexual comments when he was her boss. Ginny Thomas said in the text, quote, "The intense pressure you and our president are now experiencing are more intense than anything experienced, but I only felt a fraction of it in 1991." End quote. Justice Thomas strongly denied the accusations. The first of the 29 messages between Ginny Thomas and Meadows was sent on November 5th, 2 days after the election. She sent him a link to a YouTube video labeled "Trump Sting with CIA Director Steve Biesenik, the biggest election story in history, QFS, blockchain," end quote. Biesenik, a former State Department official, is a far-right commentator who has falsely claimed that the 2021 massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, was a, quote, false flag operation to push gun control agenda. The video that Thomas shared with Meadows is no longer available on YouTube, but Thomas wrote to Meadows, quote, "I hope this is true. Never heard anything like this before, or even a hint of it. Possible? Question mark, end quote. She added, quote, "Watermarked ballots in over 12 states have been part of a huge Trump and military white hat sting operation in 12 key battleground states," end quote. During that period, supporters of the QAnon extremist ideology embraced a false theory that Trump had watermarked mail-in ballots so he could track potential fraud. A refrain in QAnon circles at the time was, quote, "Watch the water," end quote. In the November 5th message to Meadows, Ginny Thomas went on to quote a passage that had circulated on right-wing websites. Quote, "Biden crime family and ballot fraud co-conspirators, including elected officials, bureaucrats, social media censorship mongers, fake stream media reporters, etc., are being arrested and detained for ballot fraud right now and over coming days, and will be living in barges off Gitmo to face military tribunals for sedition," end quote. The next day, November 6th, Thomas sent a follow-up to Meadows, quote, "Do not concede. It takes time for the army who is gathering for his back," end quote. It is unclear if Meadows responded to that one. On November 10th, Ginny Thomas drew a reply from Meadows. She wrote, quote, "Mark, I wanted to text you and tell you for days you are in my prayers," end quote. She continued by urging him to, quote, "Help this great president stand firm. This is the greatest heist of our history," end quote. Thomas added in that message that Meadows should, quote, "Listen to Rush, Mark Stein, Bongino, Cleta," end quote, apparently referring to conservative commentators Rush Limbaugh, Mark Stein, and Dan Bongino, as well as lawyer Cleta Mitchell, who was involved in Trump's push to claim victory in Georgia despite Biden's certified win there. 1 minute later, Meadows responded, quote, "I will stand firm. We will fight until there is no fight left. Our country is too precious to give up on. Thanks for all you do," end quote. 9 minutes after that, Ginny Thomas replied, quote, "Tearing up and praying for you guys. So proud to know you," end quote. Later that night, Ginny Thomas messaged Meadows, seeming to react to a cable news segment. She texted, quote, "Van Jones spins interestingly, but shows us the balls being juggled too," end quote. She was referring to the prominent CNN commentator, Van Jones. Thomas then turned to her frustrations with congressional Republicans and said she wished more of them were rallying behind Trump and being more active with his base voters, who were furious about the election. She wrote, Quote, House and Senate guys are pathetic, too. Only 4 GOP House members seen out in street rallies with the grassroots. Gohmert, Jordan, Gosar, and Roy. End quote. She appeared to be referring to Republican House members Louis Gohmert of Texas, Jim Jordan of Ohio, Paul Gosar of Arizona, and Chip Roy of Texas. This was a troubled time for Trump. News organizations had declared Biden the winner on November 7th. After a review of vote totals in each state and the electoral count. Trump's legal operation was divided between his campaign's official lawyers and Rudy Giuliani, Trump's confidant and personal attorney, who was fast asserting control of his campaign's legal strategy. While many Republicans supported Trump's filing of legal challenges in several states, his lawyers stumbled in court, and many allies by mid-November were privately confiding that Trump's legal battle would be short-lived. Yet, Ginny Thomas urged Meadows to plow ahead, rally Republicans around Trump, and remind them of his enduring political capital. She wrote in her text message to him late on November 10th, quote, Where the heck are all those who benefited by President's coattails? End quote. She then told Meadows to watch a YouTube video about the power of never conceding. Meadows might not have been Thomas's only contact inside the Trump White House that week. On November 13, she texted Meadows about her outreach to, quote, Jared, end quote, potentially a reference to Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior White House advisor. She wrote, quote, just forwarded to your Gmail an email I sent Jared this AM. Sidney Powell and improved coordination now will help the cavalry come and fraud exposed and America saved, end quote. The messages provided to the House Select Committee do not show a response to this by Meadows. And Jared Kushner did not respond to a request for comment. Sidney Powell was becoming ubiquitous on television and winning the president's favor, according to several Trump advisors, as she claimed without evidence that electronic voting systems had stolen the election from Trump by switching millions of ballots in Biden's favor. She claimed, again without evidence, that hundreds of thousands of ballots were appearing out of nowhere and that a global communist conspiracy was afoot involving Venezuela, Cuba, and probably China. Still, while Trump cheered some of Powell's commentary, she was a polarizing figure in his orbit. Her views were considered so extreme and unsupported by evidence that David Bossie, a longtime Trump supporter, told others that she was peddling, quote, concocted bullshit, end quote. After Fox News host Tucker Carlson contacted Powell about her claim that electronic voting machines had switched ballots to Biden, he, Carlson, told his viewers that he found her answers evasive and that she had shown no evidence to support her assertion. He stopped having her on his program. Ginny Thomas stood by Sidney Powell. She wrote to Meadows on November 13, quote, don't let her and your assets be marginalized. Instead, help her be the lead and the face, end quote. The following day, November 14, Thomas sent Mark Meadows material she said was from Connie Hare, chief of staff to Louis Gohmert. It is not clear if she was passing on a message from Hare or sharing Hare's perspective as guidance for Meadows. The text message seems to quote Hare's belief that, quote, the most important thing you can realize right now is that there are no rules in war. This war is psychological, psyop, end quote. The text from Ginny Thomas states. Hare said yesterday that she did not have any specific recollection of that text message. On November 19, which would be a crucial day for Sidney Powell as she spoke at a news conference at the Republican National Committee, Ginny Thomas continued to bolster Powell's standing in a text to Meadows. Thomas wrote, quote, Mark, don't want to wake you. It sounds like Sydney and her team are getting inundated with evidence of fraud. Make a plan. Release the Kraken and save us from the left taking America down. End quote. Release the Kraken had become a catchphrase on the far right after the election, used as shorthand for the anticipated exposure of a voter fraud conspiracy that would upend Biden's victory with the same force as a Kraken, a mythical giant sea monster. In that same exchange, Thomas also at one point offered Meadows advice on managing the West Wing staff. She wrote, quote, suggestion, you need to buck up your team on the inside, Mark. The lower level insiders are scared, fearful, or sending out signals of hopelessness versus an awareness of the existential threat to America right now. You can buck them up, strengthen their spirits, end quote. Ginny also wrote, Monica Crowley, referring to the conservative commentator, may have a sense of this from her Nixon days, end quote. Crowley was a top official in Trump's Treasury Department. She had been an aide to former President Richard Nixon years after he resigned from office in 1974 because of the Watergate scandal. All right, let me pause here for our break. There is a couple more pages of this madness that I'll share with you when we come back. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.